Sometimes we talk about older people of the future as though these people are just going to emerge. It's us. It's basically almost everyone who is alive at the moment. It's when you get a mismatch between the reality of population ageing and the policies that are being suggested in the public's mind, that's when you get a pushback.
Conversations on the Future focuses on fundamental existential issues beyond the daily news. In a world where older people outnumber the younger, what will the future look like? I speak with Dr. Sarah Harper, Professor of Gerontology at the University of Oxford and Director of the Oxford Institute of Population Aging. Dr. Harper shares her views on falling childbearing and mortality rates and ways to approach the phenomenon of an aging population.
I think the really important thing about ageing is that we should look at it from a population level. So we're really talking about what we call age structural change, and that is as much about falling childbearing as it is about falling mortality rates, late life mortality rates. And if we look at it from that point of view, we get a really holistic way and suggest that probably most countries across the 21st century will age. And we will move from societies where we have lots and lots of young people being born and coming into our economies and driving them, to societies where most of the population are midlife or over. And by the end of the 21st century, we'll have gone through that transition. But it's what's happening across the 21st century that I think people find concerning. So if you put it in that perspective, I think the really important thing is people talk about economic dependency ratios, and that is the number of workers that are coming into our societies and economies. If we can keep our population healthy for as long as possible, then there's no reason why, as older adults, we shouldn't be contributing to our society. And the second thing is that as we're living longer, it's really important that we keep healthy. So you put those two things together, and older adults from midlife onwards will have lots of opportunities to make up for the fact that we're having smaller numbers of children. And I think that's the way we should be looking at it.
Interesting. So the last UN Summit on Aging appears to have been 20 years ago. Am I right? In 2012? But I saw that later a conference in New York in 2015 found that, and I quote this, the development agenda has fallen short of achieving effective responses to the situation of older persons. So are we preparing adequately for a world just 28 years from now in which 1 in 6 people will be 65 or older?
The big conference on ageing was about 40 years ago. And then we had another follow-up conference 20 years ago. It is very true that this is something that's been on government agendas for quite some time. There are some key countries that I think are really beginning to prepare. The UK, I have to say, prior to Brexit, was in a really very good place. And that was because we were looking at it very holistically. We weren't just looking at the economy and labour markets. We were also looking at things around healthcare. We were looking at our in physical environments, the housing, the public spaces, transport, education. And I think that kind of holistic approach is very important. But there are other countries that are really engaging with this. Obviously, different parts of the world are aging at different times. But if we look at what's happening in Japan and Korea, for example, Singapore, these countries have very good forward planning where they're really beginning to look at it from a holistic point of view. Australia is another example. So I think although there are lots of governments who are addressing this, there are two problems. One is what we call institutional lag or structural lag, and that is that we're still using 21st century institutions and ways of thinking to tackle this 21st problem. And the other is, sadly, and often I think it's due to misinformation, there is some resistance in some parts of the world to doing simple things like saying, if we're going to be living much longer and we're going to be healthier, we may wish to work longer and contribute more. And it's when you get a mismatch between the reality of population ageing and the policies that are being suggested in the public's mind, that's when you get a pushback and it makes it much more difficult.
In the United States in particular, fertility rates seem to be falling. And apparently 23 countries are expected to see their populations halve by 2100. And as a result, the number of people on the planet will peak apparently at 9.7 billion in 2064. and then fall to 8.8 billion by the end of the century. But I can't help but wondering what the state of the planet will be when you have so many older people, leave alone the youth inheriting a planet that is, with dramatically reduced biodiversity, hotter, more volatile biosphere. What kind of a world will older people inherit, so to speak?
That is a very, very important perspective because, of course, population aging is not occurring in a vacuum. We have all these other 21st challenges. And yes, climate and environmental change, introduction of new technologies, rapid urbanization, these are all happening at roughly the same time. I think the way to look at it is to say these trends have got their own motion and dynamic. And although you can pull policy levers at the international level, it's very difficult, really, to be able to sort of separate them. And the really important thing is for governments to take a holistic view and really try to make societies and individuals resilient. And there is a debate at the moment about falling birth rates. You are correct. In about 2/3 of the world's countries, we already have populations where women are at or near or even below replacement level. Most of Europe is below replacement level. Exactly the same. In fact, all of Europe is below replacement level. Many parts of Asia, many OECD countries fall into that category. And we only really have the countries in sub-Saharan Africa where we still have very high childbearing rates. And that is good. It's good for the planet. It's good for individuals. It's good for women and families. But it's a matter of trying to adapt to that. And those people who say we should be boosting childbearing, if we look at it from a population point of view, of course, it's the number of workers to the number of dependents. So if you encourage women to have a lot of children, as, for example, they're trying to do in China, not that successfully at the moment, but that's obviously one of their policies, then you will end up with a large number of dependents who are children. And of course, it'll be 20 years before the babies that are being born today come into one's economy. And all we're doing is just pushing off the fact that we are going to have an aging population. But that doesn't mean we're going to have a population of old, frail people. It just means that we will be living, instead of in a population pyramid, we're going to be living in more of a skyscraper. And I think once we get to the end of the century, if we can get there successfully, then the centuries coming up will have their own challenges, but they won't have this population aging challenge.
Now, as you sort of alluded to, there's an array of technology which has been invented for aging populations. Japan is one place where they've done this. And just the other day, I was talking to an author on this program of ours, and we were talking about how it will soon be possible to have a robot taking care of one's grandmother. So it made me wonder, do you see a world where people actually are more isolated?
That is really important question. And of course, it's about us. Sometimes we talk about older people of the future as though these people are just going to emerge. It's us. It's basically almost everyone who is alive at the moment. If we are lucky, huge numbers of them are going to live to become the older people of the future. And I think technology can be really helpful, but the interface between people and technology is the area we really have to focus on. So if we look at what's happened during the pandemic, we have research from all over the world which says that older adults have become so much more connected with each other, with their families, with health services, with all sorts of other services external to the home through the internet, through Zoom, through Facebook, through all these kind of technologies. And I think the one fear is that is obviously a very good thing, and technology can connect. But we must be careful we don't move into a world where, almost as you describe it, we have, families and carers saying, well, robots can do that. And therefore, we know mum is fine because we've got her a robot. And of course, older adults are people, just like you and I. And just like you and I would hate to think that we were isolated being looked after by a robot. So older people feel exactly the same. So I think it's a really interesting question. The technology is definitely there. We know that. Whether it will be accepted by large numbers of the population and whether we can sensitively introduce it into things like the caring world is another question. But definitely, I think it is, most governments are looking actually at that acceptance, at the ethics of using technology. The market may be pushing ahead with all sorts of technologies, but I think many governments are aware that not only with older adults, but with all sorts of people who are dependents, that the interface between the person and the technology is really where, going forward, we have to look at and understand, and also just get a public that feels comfortable with that kind of a world.
Dr. Sarah Harper, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Thank you for joining Conversations on the Future.
Okay, thank you.